Hey everybody. Today I was doing a little more work here on my native tank, and what I was doing was adding more LEDs to the top of it. If you'll notice off to the right, you've still got a lot of that real sparkly effect that you get from the LEDs, but it's a lot brighter if you've been following along with my videos. Initially I had it set up with a single LED unit over there, and now I actually have 5 small LED units over there. And they're very cheaply made. They were actually sold as outdoor floodlight units, and I just sort of repurposed them to use on my aquarium. I also put 2 of the units off to the left in replacement of one of the little 18-inch T8 fluorescent tubes that was on the left-hand side, so you will actually notice a vast color difference in the fish when they swim towards the front of the tank. On the far left hand side you will see much more color in them, and that is because of the LED that's shining on them. So I've been talking about doing a video to explain a little bit about LEDs and how LEDs work and why they're different than other lights, and I'm going to try to stay focused on this one. Every time I get talking about lights I just wander all over the place, because light is really interesting stuff and it affects your aquarium in a lot of ways that you probably don't even think about. So let's start by talking about how a standard incandescent light bulb, you know, the Thomas Edison style light bulb that has a little piece of curly corkscrew metal called tungsten, that is the filament that runs through the middle of a vacuum chamber. The vacuum part is important for the longevity of the bulb, but it doesn't change anything as far as the way it glows. What happens is electricity runs through a little piece of wire, and that wire causes resistance. The electricity has trouble flowing through it. That resistance or friction causes heat, and that little piece of wire gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and eventually it glows until it's a bright white glowing piece of wire, and light shines off of it. Really inefficient way to produce light. It is between 95 and 97% inefficient. In other words, 95 to 97% of the electricity you run through that light bulb is converted into heat, and only 3 to 5% of that energy is converted into light. Very effective space heater, not a very effective way of making light, but it does have its advantages, and we'll get to them. The way a fluorescent tube creates light is ultraviolet radiation is shown through the tube that is filled with various gases depending on what color temperature spectrum light they're trying to produce. We'll get to that as well. But it flows through these various gases inside the tube, and as those gases get excited by the flow of electrons through them, they react with a powdered phosphor that coats the inside of the tubes, and it begins glowing. And that's how a fluorescent tube creates light. So the way an LED creates light is a little computer chip or diode. They are generally simply referred to as chips. So if you're talking to somebody about your LED and you refer to the bulb, that is not accurate. It does not have a bulb. It has a chip in it. It is a little tiny computer chip, and it is a sandwich made of 2 separate semiconductors. The current comes in through one semiconductor and goes out through the other. And as the current, and we're talking microcurrents here, passes through and makes the jump from one semiconductor to the other, it experiences a little bit of resistance, and it loses a little bit of its energy as it makes that jump. Now, instead of shedding that energy in the form of heat, it sheds a photon instead. It actually sheds a little particle of light. So that is a very different way of producing light than other forms of light, and it takes a very small amount of electricity, relatively speaking. They're very much more efficient, but they have a lot of problems with them. One of the things that LEDs are good for, and there's a couple that they're very good for, in addition to their efficiency. One is the way the light is produced. You've got a flat, just think of a computer chip, a little tiny microchip. It's a flat surface. When the photons are shed, they leave that surface perpendicular to the surface of the chip. So all of your photons are leaving, flowing in the same direction. You basically have a beam of light. I actually have a flashlight that's an LED flashlight, and if you focus it just right, you can actually see the computer chip. Let me shine this on below the tank and see if it shows up. Alright, you see that little round light? You see how it focuses right there? You can actually see the computer chip. That is what the computer chip looks like that's producing the light. Now as that light shines off, that's what would come out if I didn't have this lens on the front of it that bends the light. And of course then I can make it into a beam, and I can make it round and bigger and wider, and I can focus it. But when you focus it to a straight beam, you actually see the computer chip itself. So the light actually sheds from the source very differently than it does from other sources of light. Other sources of light shed their light 360 degrees. It radiates outward in all directions. That's why most forms of light come with reflectors. All that light that's shining in the wrong direction, you need to find a way to bounce that back and make it go in the direction you want it to go in. An LED starts by shining all of the photons in one direction. So it's not exactly polarized light, but it's very close. It's a very odd sort of focused rays of light that shine down, and I don't know why those rays sparkle through the water that they do, but that's why you get that sparkle in the water with an LED and no other form of light, because you've got all of the beams of light coming in the same direction in rows almost. It's almost parallel lines of light coming down into your tank. Excuse me. And that's what gives you that twinkly sparkle when you have ripples in the water. Presumably as the water moves and the light is shining through the currents, that actually causes those parallel lines to bend, and as it bends and wobbles back and forth, that's what gives you that sort of ripply sparkly effect. Not exactly sure what's going on there. I did a little bit of research today but wasn't able to find anything that specifically said why you get that shimmy and sparkle in the water. But one of the downsides of LEDs is well, it depends on what you want to use them for. It could be considered an upside. The way the light is produced, remember, it's a little microcircuit that flows from one semiconductor to another. Depending on what types of semiconductors are used, a different amount of energy is shed, and depending on the amount of energy that's shed, it sheds it in a certain wavelength of light. So a wavelength of light is what we could think of as a color. There really is no such thing as colors. It's all just wavelengths of light. And our eyes pick up certain wavelengths, and our brains perceive it as being this color or that color. But really, it's just a wavelength of light. That is important. That will come into play in a moment. Remember that. No such thing as color. It's only wavelengths of light. So when you've got like these blue and red LEDs that you see as either indicator lights or Christmas lights, those are LEDs that are actually producing that wavelength of light because of the materials used when they make it. There is no material that actually makes a white light. So that's a problem if you want to use LEDs as lighting, and it's definitely a problem when you start getting into the more subtle aspects of lighting, like growing plants who need very specific wavelengths, and photography, which has to deal with issues like color rendering. So there's different ways that you can produce white light, despite the fact that there is no semiconductor combination that will actually produce it. The two most common ways are shining either blue or ultraviolet light through a specific phosphor that actually converts it into a white light. The other way is when you see that single chip, it's not actually a single chip. It's a really, really tiny array of red, blue, and green chips. and when you mix all three primary colors of light, it appears to be white. So what you're really shining on, say, a plant is a very specific red spectrum, a very specific blue spectrum, and a very specific green spectrum. So just because it appears white to you and I, a plant doesn't receive the light the same way we do. It's only getting three specific spectrums of light. That's why most LEDs will have their white lights, but then they also have reds and blues mixed in. Those reds and blues are very specific reds and blues that are supposed to be hitting peak absorption levels of PAR radiation for plants, and that's why you have those additional reds and blues in there. Plus they're also put in there for color rendering reasons. You don't really get that rich color without those blues and reds added in, because the white light you're seeing is kind of a fake white light. They're faking it. When you've got an incandescent bulb, even though it's really inefficient, the way it produces light, remember, it's gotten warmer and warmer and warmer, and it's made its way all the way up through that color temperature spectrum, because this is exactly what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the rising temperature, and it starts out at a soft, warm red glow, and it gets brighter and brighter, and eventually it gets up through the yellows and oranges, and then you get into this bright white light. So when you shine incandescent light, you get 100% true color rendering, and you also get full spectrum. So if you're growing plants and you're looking on a bulb and you're trying to see what the color temperature is, and it's an incandescent bulb, there is none. It's just all incandescent bulbs are full spectrum bulbs, and they're true full spectrum bulbs. When you buy fluorescent bulbs that say full spectrum, again, it's the same thing. That's why they mark those tubes with color temperatures, because they're faking it. They're trying to mimic a certain color appearance that you would see. So while that might look nice in your tank, it still may not be the right color spectrums for your plants to grow. And depending on the color of your fish, what type of feel or appearance you're looking for, the color rendering in your tank is a lot more important than you would realize. Switching your lights around, using different types of lights, makes a huge difference in how your tank actually appears. And I spend a lot of time fiddling around with my lights to get the tanks looking the way I want them to look. Now the problem is, when you get back talking about the LEDs again, because that's what I want to focus on here, when you've got, I'll say, inexpensive LEDs, lower quality LEDs, they use even more cheating sort of ways to produce your white light. It's, there's not just one recipe to come up with what appears to be white light. And when you've got white light, you've still got the full range of color temperature within that white light. So these LEDs, for example, that I've bought, these low budget sort of outdoor floodlights that aren't necessarily meant for color rendering purposes or anything else. They're just meant to light up an area outside your house so you can see what you're doing or scare burglars away. Who cares if it's a true 6500K, Well, even if it was a true 6500K in appearance, you still have to find out, how did they get to that 6500K? What blend of wavelengths are in there? Because it might be garbage for your plants. It might appear to be white, it might appear to be 6500K, but it might be garbage for your plants. So if you've got a low budget LED, even one that's designed for your aquarium, it may not be doing all it's cracked up to be, just because it looks nice and bright and it gives a nice shimmy. If you're trying to grow plants under it, it may not be doing all you think it is. Another way they can get white light from an LED is by using the reds and the blues, and then, or the ultraviolet even, and shining it through like a color filter, which again does not give you true blue light spectrum or whatever. It's giving you this fake. They're kind of cheating when they come up with this color. So you got to be careful when you use LEDs, especially in a planted tank. That's one of the reasons I don't use LEDs in a lot of my tanks, because if you really want to do good as far as your plants growing well without encouraging a lot of algal growth, you really need to spend the money and get a good quality LED. I'm going to go ahead and throw some food here in the tank and get everybody whipped up into a frenzy for a minute, and we will explain why the good LED is more important. And that has to do with algae control. Most plants, the kinds of plants we would want to grow, and on a side note, I don't think that Java fern is going to stay in this tank. I like the look of having plants in it, just not those. The Java fern just doesn't look right to me, so that's probably not going to stay in there. But most of the higher order plants, like the Java fern or anything else that we would want to grow in our tanks, have two peak absorption levels where they really spike on the wavelengths of light that they absorb to grow properly. You've got one big spike in the red and you've got one big spike in the blue. But the plants don't use much in the middle. That's why they appear to be green. They don't absorb a lot of the greens and yellows. They reflect them back. They absorb the reds and the blues, and so therefore you see a green plant and you see these yellows and greens in the plants. Algae and cyanobacteria actually thrive more on those wasted wavelengths of light. The light that your plants don't necessarily use do get used by algae. So if you're using these cheap LEDs like I've got on here now, I'm fully expecting to see some changes happen within the tank. Not only is there a lot more light in the tank now, it's very different light, and it's not the best quality light. I've used these lights before. I've actually had these on my gourami tank. I got rid of them because of the algae problems, and I put a shop light with good brand name 6500K, you know, and I made a few other adjustments. I cut down on feeding and a few other things, and I got rid of my algae problem altogether without really doing anything other than that in my gourami tank. So now that I've got these same LEDs back on this tank, and I do have a combination, I've got my shop light on there, so I still do have the two 4-foot tubes. That's in the rear part of the tank off to the left, and then off to the right I have all those LEDs, and then I have two of the LEDs off to the left, and you don't get the sparkle because the light from the tubes actually sort of negates the sparkle that you would get, and there's not a lot of movement down at that end of the tank anyway on the water, and you need the water movement to get the sparkle. But what you do get by having the LED on that end of the tank is the color rendering. You've got the reds, blues, and greens that you don't really get from that fluorescent tube. Again, with the 6500K fluorescent tube, you lose a little bit of the warmth. You've got that sort of harsh kind of look on the tank, but you get good color rendering, and it's good for your plants. So there's a lot of different compromises you have to use if you're going to do things on a budget. Could I go out and buy $400 Kessel LEDs? Sure. Sure, I could if I had that kind of money. But to me, I don't know. I wouldn't really even want $400 lights. That seems ridiculous to me to put LEDs like that when I can put a shop light on there for $18 with a couple of 6500K tubes in it, and I don't think anybody can argue that that tank doesn't look good. So I just don't see the necessity of putting that kind of quality lights on there. I do have an LED strip. I've got it on my 125 right now. It was almost $60 for an 30-inch strip. And as far as I can tell, it's okay, but it was a middle-of-the-road LED, and I just don't think it really cut it. I had it on my brackish tank. I got it for the purposes of trying to cut back on the amount of cyanobacteria I had in there, because I had originally had these cheap LEDs on that as well. And in the end, I wound up getting rid of all of it and going back to just a fluorescent tube and setting up a new brackish tank altogether. So I tend to be a little leery about LEDs. I also am a gardener, and I have tinkered a lot with indoor plants and doing stuff over the winter just as a hobby to keep me sane over the winter. And I have tinkered a lot with trying to grow plants with various LEDs and different grow panels and LED panels and stuff like that, and they've all got their ups and downs, and none of them really work the way good old-fashioned fluorescent tubes work, or incandescent. Again, with the incandescent, you generate a ton of heat and you waste a lot of electricity. Those are your two big down points with the incandescent. Great color rendering, and full spectrum for your plants, but you waste a ton of electricity and you generate a ton of heat. With the fluorescents, you've got to kind of pick and choose your color temperature. You've got to use a higher quality tube, and you've got to stay on the higher end color temperature. If you have planted tanks, you need to stay, I would say, above 5500 K, between 5500 K and 10,000 K with your fluorescent tubes. When you get to your LEDs, most LEDs don't come with color temperature. If they do, they usually just say it's 10,000 K or it's bright white, but you don't know how they got to that end result. So you've got to be careful when you choose your LED. Do as much research as you can and buy the highest brand, most reputable, highest rated brand you can afford when you're looking at LEDs. So I hope that was a nice little well-rounded look at LEDs, and it gave you some food for thought, some stuff to think about. I'm fascinated by LEDs. I have been for years, so if you've got any questions or comments or anything like that, feel free to leave them below. I'll do my best to answer them if I can. If not, I can always jump on the interwebs and do a little bit of research and hopefully be able to answer any questions for you. So please subscribe if you're not already. That way you won't miss anything I got coming up on this tank or any of my others. I do have lots of other tanks here in this room, and we will be doing some video on them real soon as well. So thanks again for watching this one. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something, and I will see you real soon on the next one.